If you look down at Earth from space, besides China's Great Wall, there is another man-made megastructure capable of challenging this planet's curvature. It stretches over 5,600 kilometers, a distance long enough to connect London, the capital of the United Kingdom, all the way to Istanbul, Turkey. But what is truly terrifying is this magnificent megastructure was not built to stop tank driving, armed invading armies with guns and cannons. It was built simply to deal with a group of small, soft-furred creatures. Today we are reopening one of the most insane and most brutal engineering project files in Australian history. This is a story that cost hundreds of millions of dollars in an attempt to defy nature, a massive gamble to draw a line between life and death with barbed wire, and unintentionally triggered a devastating ecological butterfly effect that completely reshaped the face of an entire continent. To understand why a modern nation would decide to cut its own continent with an endless fence and forcibly slice its own land in two, we need to turn back the clock to October 1859. The source of this great catastrophe was not an accident, but came from the arrogance and homesickness of a white nobleman. Thomas Austin was an extremely wealthy English immigrant. At Barwon Park in Victoria, southeastern Australia, he owned a vast estate because he deeply missed life back in England, where every weekend he would go out hunting with a gun. Austin had his nephew ship him a gift destined to change everything: 24 European wild rabbits. When those wooden crates were opened, he confidently declared releasing a few rabbits would cause absolutely no harm, and would even bring a taste of home, and add a few new targets for hunting. But those words were perhaps the most catastrophically wrong and most destructive words in the history of world ecology. Australia had been isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years, forming an extremely unique ecosystem, home to a vast number of marsupial animals. There were no harsh freezing winters to limit the reproduction of small animals. There were also no wolves, bears, or large predatory birds, those natural predators in Europe that specifically kept rabbits in check. For the 24 rabbits Thomas Austin brought, Australia was essentially an unlimited feast with absolutely no defenders. The disaster began with a terrifying biological breeding offensive. A European female rabbit has a gestation period of only about 30 days. Each litter can produce 4 to 7 young. Even more alarming, within just a few hours of giving birth, a female rabbit can become pregnant again immediately. Under Australia's warm climate and abundant grassland conditions, a single pair of rabbits within just a year and a half could produce as many as 184 offspring. Less than 10 years after that fateful release, people estimated that already more than 2 million rabbits per year were being shot or caught in traps, yet their numbers showed absolutely no sign of decreasing. They launched a massive invasion campaign, spreading at a rate of about 130 kilometers per year, crossing rivers and passing through arid wastelands, spreading all the way across southern and central Australia. By the 1890s, the rabbit population had exploded to hundreds of millions, at one point even estimated to have reached 10 billion. The sky did not darken from locusts, but the ground was covered by countless constantly writhing gray masses, turning the land into a gray blur. The destruction they caused was almost impossible to measure. Rabbits did not simply chew on grass. Their digestive systems and tooth structure allowed them to gnaw through everything, from eucalyptus trees, tree bark, and plant roots, to newly sprouting seedlings and tender shoots. Nothing was spared. Once the surface vegetation had been gnawed down to bare ground, plant root systems could no longer hold the soil below in place. Desert winds swept in and triggered widespread soil erosion. Farmers of that era recorded this scene in horror. They watched helplessly as entire hillsides seemed to be moving on their own. In reality, those were massive sand dunes, because not a single blade of grass remained to hold them in place, and they began to collapse entirely. When the grass disappeared completely, Australia's economy was pushed to the brink of collapse. In the 19th century and early 20th century, Australia was known as the nation riding on the sheep's back. Wool exports were the backbone of the entire national economy, contributing to the national treasury, an enormously significant source of revenue. But the problem was, tens of millions of sheep were literally starving to death because they simply could not compete with those tens of billions of rabbits and their frantic feeding pace. The Australian government fell into unprecedented despair. They deployed every weapon they could think of: poison bait and mechanical chemical traps, hired hunters who shot day and night, even using explosives to blow up rabbit burrows. But faced with the rabbits' exponential rate of reproduction, kill 1 million today, and 2 million would reappear tomorrow, the rabbits had completely won. When people were powerless to eliminate these furry creatures, officials in Western Australia decided to adopt a primitive and ancient, yet the most extreme defensive method possible: build a massive wall to keep them out. The year was 1901. Western Australia at that time was still relatively untouched land, with extremely fertile wheat belts, and had not yet been reached by the devastation spreading from the east coast, the rabbit plague. To protect this precious land, the government ordered construction of the first rabbit-proof fence. The goal was to draw a straight line across the entire continent, stretching from a southern port all the way north to the waters near Port Hedland. By the time construction was completed in 1907, this fence had a total planned length of 1,833 kilometers. At the time, it was the world's longest continuous fence. But drawing a straight line on a map is easy. Actually carrying it out across one of the harshest terrains on Earth was a complete and utter engineering nightmare. Remember, this was the early 20th century. There were no four-wheel drive pickup trucks, no helicopter-delivered aerial equipment, and no automatic drilling machines. Everything had to rely solely on human labor. Thousands of tons of high-strength galvanized iron wire, fine wire mesh, and roughly 400,000 wooden posts all had to be transported through the desert. The only means of transportation at the time were slowly advancing horse-drawn caravans, plus hundreds of camels driven by Afghan-Australian camel handlers. Summer temperatures in Australia's remote outback frequently soared to 50 degrees Celsius. When sandstorms hundreds of meters high rose up, they were powerful enough to strip the skin from sun-beaten workers right off their faces. Fresh water was an extreme luxury. Under that scorching sun that blazed like fire, workers had to dig thousands upon thousands of deep pits, penetrating through hard clay layers and loose sandy ground. From a technical and structural standpoint, this fence was not simply erected on the surface, because rabbits are extremely skilled at digging. So the wire mesh also had to be buried at least 15 centimeters underground and extend about 1.2 meters above the ground to prevent termite damage and decay. Engineers had to venture deep into the forest to cut extremely hard local timber, such as ebony and jam tree wood, to use as fence posts. Construction costs kept climbing steadily, eventually exceeding £80,000. In today's terms, that is equivalent to tens of millions of dollars. But the most ironic and bitter part was when the exhausted workers finally finished the last few sections at the northern end of fence Number 1. The pioneer rabbits in the south had already slipped through gaps that had not yet been sealed. They had crossed the defense line. The Western Australia government did not give up. They immediately ordered construction of fence number 2, pulling the defense line further back to the west, reaching a length of 1,166 kilometers. Then they built an additional fence of about 257 kilometers, known as fence number 3, forming an entire system, like a giant spider web of blockades. In total, they erected over 3,256 kilometers of wire mesh fencing, although many mocked the project as a shameful failure because the rabbits could still get through. But in reality, this massive wire mesh system did significantly slow down the advance of the rabbit population. It was precisely this delay that gave farmers in Western Australia's wheat belt invaluable golden time, allowing them to develop agriculture, saving millions of dollars in losses each year, and keeping the entire state's economy from completely collapsing. But just as the West was still struggling against the herbivores, in southeastern Australia, sheep farmers faced another even more dangerous, more bloody and physically larger enemy: the wild dogs, the dingo. The dingo is the largest land carnivore on the Australian continent, the largest land carnivore by body size. It is said that around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, it arrived here with Asian seafarers. Within the native ecosystem, the dingo played the role of top predator, maintaining the natural balance. But for Australia's vast sheep industry, the dingo was practically the embodiment of evil. Sheep move slowly and are almost completely defenseless. Once a pack of dingoes invaded a pasture, they did not simply kill one or two to fill their bellies. On the contrary, when they saw the sheep fleeing in panic, their hunting instincts were completely ignited. Dingoes would often carry out excessive slaughter, breaking the necks of dozens of sheep in a single night, and then turn and leave without even eating the meat. New South Wales, South Australia, and tens of thousands of farmers in Queensland had seen their entire livelihoods wiped out overnight, facing the danger of cascading bankruptcy. Beginning in the early 20th century, state governments gradually began building scattered dingo fences, but dingoes are very intelligent. They could always easily go around these fragmented fences. It was not until the 1950s that a bold and historically significant decision was finally made to consolidate all local fences into a single unified megastructure. This became the Dingo Fence, the longest linear construction project on Earth. It starts in Queensland, near Jimber, crossing the arid deserts of New South Wales, spanning dry river lake basins, and finally stretching all the way into South Australia, reaching the Great Australian Bight. Those massive limestone cliffs, its historically greatest length, once reached 5,614 kilometers, and today still stands at around 5,320 kilometers. This fence stands about 1.8 meters tall, constructed from heavy interwoven wire mesh. Part of it is buried underground, with large stones pressed along the base to prevent wild dogs from digging underneath. In some critical vulnerable section, additional electric fencing was installed. Any animal daring to come close would be jolted back. But building the fence was only half the battle. Keeping this fence stretching over 5,600 kilometers, standing firm in the harsh desert at all times, was a truly near-surreal task. This job was handed to a group of extraordinarily courageous people, known as the Boundary Patrol Officers. In the past, they rode camels. Today, they drive four-wheel drive vehicles. Their duty is to patrol non-stop along the fence day and night. They must face all kinds of natural disasters. Desert whirlwinds carrying heavy sand can bury the fence. Flash floods can tear apart the ground surface, washing away dozens of meters of barbed wire. And the enemies that damage the fence are not only natural disasters. Wild boars weighing over 100 kilograms frequently crash straight into it. Emus and kangaroos, blocked during migration, also smash through the fence as long as a small hole appears, and the patrol officer cannot patch it within a few hours. Those cunning dingoes will immediately slip through, launching a bloody massacre among the sheep flocks. Annual maintenance costs reach into the millions of Australian dollars. But in return, the dingo fence accomplished its economic mission admirably. On the southern and eastern sides of the fence, losses from wild dogs killing sheep dropped by over 90%. Lamb survival rates reached record highs. Australia's wool exports were thereby rescued and continued to bring billions of Australian dollars in revenue. At first glance, this appeared to be a glorious human victory, but nature always finds a way to punish those who intervene too harshly. When Australians erected this wall, they also inadvertently created one of the most terrifying ecological nightmares in human history. If you want to truly see the severity of this project, you do not need to stand on the ground yourself. Just open satellite photos taken from space and observe the boundary line of the Dingo Fence, and you will discover a strange phenomenon. The color of the vegetation on one side of the fence is completely different from the other side. The Dingo Fence has divided the Australian continent into two parallel worlds. Outside the fence, meaning the north and west, is the zone where dingoes still roam freely. Because the top predator still exists, the ecosystem there has retained its original wild balance, while inside the fence, meaning the south and east, has become a paradise for sheep. Dingoes have been almost completely eliminated, but once the top predator was removed, an ecological phenomenon known as the trophic cascade was immediately triggered. First, as dingoes disappeared, large native herbivores, such as kangaroos and emus, began to multiply out of control. Without the fear of being hunted, millions of kangaroos stripped the grassland completely bare, directly competing with farmers' sheep flocks for food. Vegetation was severely damaged, the land was continuously eroded, and the landscape became completely different from the other side of the fence. Entirely different, but the most terrifying consequence actually came from a phenomenon called the mesopredator release effect. In a natural state, dingoes regularly hunted two types of extremely dangerous invasive species, European red foxes and feral cats. But once dingoes were blocked outside the fence, these two medium-sized killers were like predators freed from chains. With no competition, red fox and feral cat populations exploded to millions. They were equally vicious, but not large enough to hunt adult sheep, so they stopped targeting sheep flocks and instead turned to slaughtering Australia's small-bodied native animals, such as bilbies, quolls, batongs, and bandicoots. These unique marsupial animals, faced with the cunning attacks of foxes and feral cats, were almost completely defenseless. They suffered catastrophic predation. The terrifying reality is, Australia now holds the world's worst mammal extinction record. Since Europeans first settled, the country has already lost more than 30 native mammal species, forever vanished from the face of the earth. And one of the main culprits behind this is those feral cats and red foxes that exploded in population in areas without dingoes. This is a bitter ecological paradox. The dingo fence did protect the billion-dollar sheep farming economy, but it also directly condemned the country's most precious biodiversity to a death sentence. Entering the 21st century, faced with the risk of ecological collapse and the many limitations this super fence had exposed, the various shortcomings that had come to light, Australians finally gradually came to realize their own mistakes. They began shifting toward a smarter, more localized strategy: cluster fencing. This approach rapidly grew in the 2010s. Across Queensland, people were no longer trying to divide the entire continent in two. Instead, farmers banded together to build large-scale, enclosed cluster fences. Each fencing cluster would surround multiple neighboring farms, forming a secure zone covering tens of thousands of hectares. Unlike those solitary fences crossing the desert that could easily be breached, cluster fences were more like a fortress with 360-degree protection. Inside the fencing cluster, wild predators such as wild boars and dingoes were completely cleared out, and kangaroo numbers were strictly controlled. The economic results of this approach were undeniable. In regions such as Barcaldine and Longreach, lamb survival rates rose from 20% to over 90% because sheep were no longer living in a constant state of fear. Wool quality also noticeably improved. Agricultural yields subsequently soared. Those rural towns that had been on the brink of bankruptcy due to drought and wildlife destruction found renewed vitality as a result. Tens of millions of dollars flowed back into local economies. And the cluster fencing also allowed farmers to more actively manage grassland and control the degree of grazing pressure so that vegetation could recover better even after severe drought. However, the greatest modern value of this fencing strategy, its greatest modern value, was not in sheep farming itself, but in ecological conservation. Conservation biologists learned a lesson from farmers. If fences could save sheep, they could equally save those wildlife species on the brink of extinction. So they began building fully enclosed nature reserves, using anti-climb, wire mesh, and electric fence systems. For example, Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary in South Australia, wildlife sanctuaries, and the Arid Recovery Project. Their mode of operation was very clear. Step 1. Establish an enclosed area spanning tens of thousands of hectares. Step 2. Send out hunting teams to remove 100% of red foxes, feral cats, wild boars, and rabbits from inside the fence. Step 3. Reintroduce species such as bilbies, quails, and bitongs, these endangered native species, back into the area. This model is called the island model on land. Within these secure boundaries, the presence of invasive killers was completely eliminated. True biological miracles really happened. Those native marsupial animals, once believed to have gone functionally extinct in the wild, saw their population numbers surge by 300% in just a few years. They began digging burrows again, spreading seeds and improving the soil, helping the entire desert ecosystem recover to a state close to what existed before European arrival. Australia's fenced conservation model achieved enormous success. It has even become the global gold standard. From conservation reserves protecting kiwi birds in New Zealand to projects in Africa and North America, people are adopting the approach that Australia pioneered, this enclosed fencing technique. Looking back at this history, we find it is full of wild paradoxes. It all started with nothing more than an arrogant nobleman who obtained 24 rabbits for his own amusement. 24 rabbits, which ended up triggering a biological catastrophe that devastated an entire continent. It forced humanity to pour hundreds of millions of dollars and the sweat and blood of countless workers into building a wire mesh system traversing the continent, thousands of kilometers long. The rabbit-proof fence was initially a violent and desperate human intervention measure. It did succeed in protecting Australia's multi-billion-dollar agricultural lifeline, but it also left behind unforeseen ecological wounds. It disrupted the balance of the food chain and pushed dozens of fragile small species to the edge of extinction. But after more than a century of entanglement with this barbed wire that stretched on and on. Humanity ultimately learned another way to use it, no longer treating it as a cage that cuts through nature, but as a lifeline to correct its own mistakes, to protect this fragile ecosystem in its last remaining parts, sometimes to repair the natural chaos created by humans. The answer does not lie in herbicides, nor in those complex and massive machines. Sometimes the real solution is simply a basic physical barrier, a wire fence, combined with sufficiently patient waiting. As for Australia's super fencing project, what do you think? If you had to make a choice, would you stand on the side of protecting human agricultural economies, or would you tear everything down and return this continent to its